You should always be suspicious of people who use their religion as a way to dehumanize other people, to declare some kind of... And it means that you don't deny 600,000 Georgians access to Medicaid. You get them out of the health care crisis.
Has President Biden's dog Commander ever bitten you? It's not that. It seems like a reasonable question. Joining us now, he's senior pastor of Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church and your United States Senator. Please welcome Senator Raphael Warnock. They love you. They love you. Middle. Come on. Senator, I want to thank you for not leaving.
Welcome to Georgia.
It's great to be here. Now, do you prefer to be Senator Warnock or Reverend Warnock?
Some people call me Senator Warnock, some say Reverend Warnock, some say Senator Reverend Warnock. Just call me when it's time for lunch.
That's good. That's good. I'm going to start with Senator questions, then I'm going to turn to Reverend questions. That's what's going to happen. Senator, let's start with the big news of the week. The House averted a shutdown. You have 45 days to fund the government. The kooks over there in the House haven't gotten any less unreasonable. What's going to happen?
I think what we're witnessing right now is what happens when politicians center their own interests rather than the concerns of the people that they're supposed to be representing. And I can tell you this, the people of Georgia certainly don't want to see the government shut down. They are fed up with the politics of chaos, and we need cooler heads to prevail. I think if you center the people, you can get the policy right. And there's no question that with the kind of almost 50-50 split in the Senate and in the House, of course, they've got the smallest majority. We've got to find a bipartisan path to get the things that are needed.
Has President Biden's dog Commander ever bitten you? It's not that. It seems like a reasonable question. Oh man, is it a yes? Yeah. It's an easy no. Maybe it's a hard yes.
I'm just surprised by some of these questions.
Well, I guess we'll...
Next time I'll bring Alvin the Beagle with me.
Okay. President Biden signed bipartisan... We're all going to note that he dodged that question. And that's fine.
I mean, that was a very controversial question.
President Biden signed bipartisan gun safety legislation. He also has taken a number of executive action. You recently asked the Biden administration to go further. What are the steps the administration can take to attack gun violence that they're not currently taking?
Well, the issue of gun violence is an ongoing, slow-rolling tragedy in our country. And we cannot just continue with this as business as usual. And so I've remained focused on this. I'm glad that the president opened up last week the first White House office on gun violence. I and a few of my colleagues wrote him asking him to do everything that he can. And so I'm glad that he has taken those steps. But it's no replacement for what Congress must do. Congress has to act on this issue. We have seen more mass shootings this year than we've seen days this year. And these mass shootings come up as these tragic flashpoints. They capture our attention. But then we need to think also about the kinds of violence that happens every single day in some of our poor, more marginalized communities. And the people of our country, as divided as we say we are, and there certainly are fault lines, there's no question. But a Fox News poll, and you won't hear me say that much, but a Fox News poll said that 87% of Americans, that's people on the left and the right, believe that there ought to be some kind of universal background checks, and yet we can't get any real conversation about that going on in the Congress. There is a growing chasm between what the people want from their government and what they're able to get. So we're dealing with a gun violence problem, but it is seeded by a democracy problem. The people's voices are being squeezed out of their democracy.
I want to come back to that. I'm sorry.
So I'm proud of the fact that we passed the first gun safety bill in 30 years last summer. And although it was modest, it is saving lives, but not nearly enough. And the people who sit in those seats in the Senate and in the House, we need to catch up to where the people are and pass common sense gun safety.
You mentioned the way that mass shootings focus the attention of the country, but not a lot of the kind of more quotidian like mayhem and violence and death by gun that we see every single day. One aspect that I always struggle with how to talk about, and I wanted to ask you about this both as a policymaker but also as a reverend, the most gun deaths in the United States are self-inflicted. We talk about mass shootings, we talk about murder, but the majority of gun deaths are people taking their own lives. That's about access, but it's also about people feeling hopeless, feeling alone. As a pastor, as a senator, what would it look like if preventing these deaths got the attention it deserves?
I think we have to pay attention to all of it, and these things are not necessarily separated. You know, I'm the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. There's a moment of tragedy in our church and in our history that people don't remember by and large. Everybody knows that Dr. King was a victim, if you will, of gun violence. But in 1974, Martin Luther King Jr.'s mother, who was playing the Lord's Prayer on the organ one Sunday morning, she and one of our deacons was shot and killed in our church by a deranged teenager who had access to a gun but did not have access to the mental health care that he desperately needed. And so we lost a deacon and the first lady of the church that morning. Had he had access to the kinds of guns we're seeing now, the carnage would have been worse. So we've got to pay attention to the issue of gun safety, and we also have to deal with these mental health issues. A lot of that was addressed, some of it, not nearly enough, but there were provisions to address some of the mental health issues in the bill we passed last summer. I also have introduced legislation to deal with the mental health concerns in our schools. I recently introduced a piece of legislation to get counselors and therapists in our schools because our kids are undergoing so much trauma. 3 years of a pandemic, the loneliness and isolation that kids feel, the challenges and pressures around social media, our kids are undergoing a lot, and we don't have nearly enough mental health care providers in our schools, and that's why I'm hoping to get my bill moving and get that passed.
There's all this polling that shows young people, especially young men, they're more likely to be disengaged from the political process, but also more likely to be disengaged from community, from belonging to a church, from belonging to any kind of organization, from having any kind of connection. I think this seems to be like a political problem. You see young people, especially young men, drifting to the right, kind of being vulnerable to some of the messages coming from the right, but you're also talking about this in terms of gun violence, about young people who are maybe drawn into conspiracies and some of the most hateful and terrible kind of places of the internet. As somebody who is not just in the Senate, but somebody thinking about how to bring more people into a church, more people just into community, how do we deal with that? How do we think about a generation of young people, a lot of whom had to spend years in their home during a pandemic, who don't seem to be reconnecting in the way that their parents or even their older siblings might?
Well, it's something I think about a lot as a pastor, and I think that our problems are political, but they are deeply spiritual. And it's why I got involved in this work. I don't think of myself as a senator who used to be a pastor. I'm a pastor serving in the Senate. And I'm always trying to look at the issues that we confront with a moral and spiritual lens. There's no question that young people, I think there's a certain kind of nuance with respect to young men, are dealing with this kind of loneliness and isolation. As you point out, we're seeing certain demagogues who are always ready to try to exploit the fault lines in our country. And I just think that most people are decent, and somehow those of us who believe in what Dr. King called the beloved community, we've got to stand up and we got to give voice to that. And we can't outsource that to anybody. We can't outsource it to politicians. We can't outsource it to celebrities. But in whatever corner of the world where you find yourself, you got to stand up and give voice to Dr. King's belief that we are tied in a single garment of destiny, that what affects one directly affects all indirectly. I think in a real sense, the pandemic reminded us of the ways in which we're connected. I call it the parable of a pandemic. All of a sudden, we found ourselves dealing with this virus, and if my neighbor, it was in my best interest for my neighbor also to be well. And although I may have gotten the virus from my neighbor, that didn't make my neighbor my enemy. It just means I need to make sure my neighbor's taken care of. And so somehow, I'm saying that we are as close in our humanity as a cough. And we got to look out for one another, and we got to apply that same spiritual logic to a whole range of issues. I need my neighbor to be covered, not only for his sake, but for mine. And I need their children to have access to a good quality education. I need them to be food secure. And I need them to have access to a future where they can raise up their families. And as I get older, pay into Social Security.
When you were on Pod Save America, right in the run-up to your election, I asked you about this. Specifically, I was trying to understand how you felt about the fact that here you are, a reverend. Your opponent wasn't just somebody that you opposed on policy grounds, but was someone who had terrible conduct, just terrible moral conduct, treating people in his life, the people around him, terribly in a way that was repugnant, and yet it remained really close. And a lot of people who profess to have Christian values, to believe in morals, who want to be righteous, held their nose and voted the other way in a very close election. And at the time you said, "I'm not touching that." And you answered, you gave me a policy answer about how different you were as policy people, and I felt like, okay, well, the election's a couple days away, let's not go deep. I get it. But here we are. I did, that's how I felt about it. But you've had some space from it.
You should come Sunday morning.
Okay.
Come to church, John.
I'll come. How do you think about that now?
Well, no, I think it's much larger than my opponent, and you point that out. Look, I think we are dealing with a deep spiritual malaise in our country. And I try to address this as a person of faith, but in a way that invites all of us to the table. What I like about Dr. King, what I like about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and so many others, is that they didn't use their faith as a weapon. They used it as a bridge to bring us together. And you should always be suspicious of people who use their religion as a way to dehumanize other people, to declare some kind of I think in all of the great faith traditions, and I'm a Christian, but in all of the great faith traditions, and in fact, people who don't claim a particular religious tradition but try to act as moral agents in the world, there is that basic understanding that you do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That means you don't try to suppress your neighbor's vote. It means you don't want them to work without having a livable wage. And it means that you don't deny 600,000 Georgians access to Medicaid. You get them out of the health care coverage. It's the gospel I try to preach on Sunday morning, and I try to live every single day.
One thing I also wanted to ask you about, you recently were the only Democrat on the banking committee to vote against a bill that would have made it easier for companies to be part of the legal cannabis, but the so-called legal cannabis business. I find this all very confusing. I was interested to hear you talk about it because everyone's walking around like marijuana is legal in a lot of states. It's not legal in any state. It remains a Schedule I drug. Can you talk about why you voted against this and what you think is this sort of, what do you think the problem is right now with the way we're going about talking about marijuana?
Yeah, I voted against it, but not for the reasons that you may think. I voted against the safer banking bill as it is currently written because my question was, who are we really making safer? And what it does is it allows businesses and banks to participate with cannabis businesses in states where it's legal. And so it creates a safe space for them. But the communities that have been most devastated by the so-called war on drugs doesn't do a thing for them at all. And I'm worried that if we pass a bill with all of the fees and the revenue that comes, and not begin to address the issue of restorative justice, we're not going to go back and get those communities that have literally, they've been hollowed out by a half century of the so-called war on drugs for using marijuana, which I guess the last several presidents admit that they used. And the consequences of that are real. The United States of America, the land of the free, is the mass incarceration capital of the world. No other country comes even close. We're about, 6% of the world's population. We warehouse 50% of the world's prisoners. We got more people in prison in the United States than any other country in the world. And all of the nations whose human rights regimes we deplore. We've got a greater number of our citizens and a greater percentage of our citizens. And we can't act like this war on drugs did not happen. After war in Europe, we put forward a Marshall Plan, and I happen to know some black and brown communities in Atlanta and in St. Louis and in Chicago and in South Central who could use a Marshall Plan, who could use some recognition that something happened to them. So I got really good colleagues, people on that banking committee. They're good people. But as I sat there, I asked myself, years from now, we'll be asking ourselves, as we do about a whole range of things, why are these problems so intractable? The racial wealth gap. Why? And I think this is what happens in real time. As I witnessed it as a participant, good people sitting around a table. There are some good reasons to move this forward, and yet I'm trying to help us to summon the will to pair justice with common sense so that everybody can be safe.
Now, before we let you go, you've agreed to play a game. There are moments these days where the news feels downright biblical. A lot of politicians are selling fire and brimstone, and it's rare we have an expert. So, it's time for a quiz we're calling, if I haven't heard it, it's New-Teronomy. And again, thank you for being here. I'm going to read you a quote, and you're going to tell us who said it, a current politician or a biblical figure of ill repute. First up,
Lord.
Here we go. I am your warrior, I am your justice, and for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution.
That sounds like a politician.
It is. It's Trump this July. My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land.
That's scripture.
That is scripture. That was Cain. Guess
Cain.
he was upset about being
Cain,
punished.
craven politician, same thing.
Yeah, there you go. Started somewhere. You must continue to keep this land. It doesn't say this. You must continue to keep this land safe and protect against an invasion.
Yeah.
It's close.
Yeah. Bible and culture.
Yeah, it's pretty
right?
close.
Right.
What do you think?
Scripture and culture. I think
Yeah,
it's both.
you know what? I'm going to give it to you
I think it's both.
because that was Governor Greg Abbott, but
The Bible is a complicated book.
look, these people have become far too numerous for us. We must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous.
Oh yeah, that's Exodus.
Yeah, that's the Pharaoh. Now, the Pharaoh couldn't. Now, a couple months ago, the Pharaoh wouldn't have been able to say that on Twitter. Now the Pharaoh could say it on Twitter again. You know what I mean? I called you demons and imps who come and parade before us and pretend that you are part of this world.
Wow. That sounds like a politician.
It was a Florida rep talking about LGBT people. It's no good. Keep the money and do with the people as you please.
Keep the money and do with the people as you please. A few things ago.
Someone in the front row says politics.
Keep the money and do it. Well, that's what happens.
That is what happens.
That's what happens. But I'm going to say politics.
It could have been Trump, but it was King Xerxes. It was King Xerxes to Haman in Esther.
Yeah.
Keep the money, do with the people as you please. Now, this is the last question. It's a serious question, actually. Before I wanted to ask you about a passage from Psalms 139, because my understanding is when you find meaningful. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. What?
That's beautiful. You ought to go back and read all of it. Yeah, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I am the magnificent craftsmanship of a magnanimous creator. I'm an idea. See? All right. Now, do I get to raise the offering now?
Sure. The floor is yours. Senator Raphael Warnock, Reverend Senator Raphael Warnock, thank you so much for being here. This was great. Really appreciate it. One more time for your senator.